Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something really interesting: mental health in medieval times. What did it feel like to be anxious, sad, or just not quite right back then? Well, there were no therapists covered by any town guilds. Before we get into it, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy what I do, and drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fun to see who's joining in. Now, settle in. Maybe dim the lights, and let's begin our journey into the past. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, people believed your thoughts, emotions, and even your energy were controlled by different fluids in your body. These weren't just ideas, they were actual body juices, and doctors at the time believed in them completely. This idea came from ancient Greece, mostly from Hippocrates and Galen, and stuck around for way too long. According to the four humors theory, your body had four main fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. If they weren't balanced, something was wrong. These fluids were also tied to your personality. Too much blood? You were cheerful and lively, but maybe annoying. The cure? Doctors might use leeches to drain some blood. Too much yellow bile made you angry and quick to act, not great for a dinner party, but perfect for battle. Black bile was linked to sadness, or what we'd now call depression. This was blamed on cold, dry environments and too much time spent sitting and thinking. And phlegm was connected to being calm, slow, or maybe just tired all the time. So if you were feeling sad or down, no one suggested therapy. Instead, you'd probably get bloodletting. Someone would cut a vein to drain your blood and fix your feelings. If that didn't help, they might give you a laxative because clearly, your sadness was somehow connected to your stomach. Doctors, and that's being generous, would ask strange questions like, "Do you feel dry or moist today?" They check your urine, look at the stars, or even smell your breath. The answer was almost always the same: your humors were out of balance. You were too hot, too cold, too wet, or too dry. And if they couldn't fix you with herbs or bleeding, they might say it was a problem for God to solve. It's important to remember these beliefs were mainstream at the time, not just weird fringe ideas. This was considered real science. So, if someone had a panic attack, there wasn't much compassion. Instead, you'd get someone in a robe looking at a chart of body fluids and saying, "Let us bleed the sadness out." Now, if your emotions weren't caused by sin or demons, or by your neighbor baking weird bread, people might say the moon was the problem. That's right. People believed the moon could mess with your mind. That's where the word lunatic comes from. It's linked to luna, the Latin word for moon. People thought too much moonlight could scramble your thoughts like eggs. This wasn't just a village myth. It was widely believed by doctors, priests, philosophers, and that one guy always yelling near the well. They thought the moon pulled at your brain fluids the same way it pulls ocean tides. So, if you acted oddly during a full moon, they didn't think you were tired or overwhelmed. They thought the moon had done something to you. Some people were even locked up temporarily until the moon changed. This was their version of just wait it out. The moon also got blamed for things like seizures, sleep problems, seeing things that weren't there, basically anything they couldn't cure with soup, leeches, or prayer. If you were crying at night or pacing around, no one asked about your feelings. They checked the sky. Even animals weren't safe from moon blame. Farmers believed their sheep acted differently, dogs howled more, and pigs ran wild during full moons. If your ox destroyed a cart, someone probably muttered, "The moon's acting up." Of course, none of this had any science behind it. But back then, science didn't exist the way we know it. Astrology was as common in medicine as caffeine is for us today. Treatments didn't just include herbs and diets, they also relied on star charts and planetary positions. So if you were struggling mentally, maybe it wasn't your brain, they thought it could just be bad moon vibes. And if you started crying for no reason, talking to your soup, or shouting at trees, the person you talked to wasn't a doctor, you went to a priest. That's because in the Middle Ages, people believed the mind was a battleground between good and evil. Any strange behavior was seen as spiritual, not medical. Feeling anxious? That meant the devil was nearby. Hearing voices, demonic activity, depression, probably a forgotten sin. Priests were like the mental health experts of the time, but instead of therapy, they gave you confession, fasting, and a reminder that you were made from dust. If you showed signs of what we'd now call mental illness, they'd look for moral problems, skipping church, laughing too much, guilty. In more serious cases like hallucinations, not speaking, or acting wildly, the church stepped in harder. You might be sent on a pilgrimage, forced to pray all night, or even given a mini exorcism to make sure your sadness wasn't actually a demon. Even normal emotions were treated suspiciously. Too happy, you were being vain. Too sad, they called it acedia, which meant spiritual laziness. It was treated with guilt and lots of psalms. If you were depressed, the church didn't offer comfort. They said you were morally weak and not trying hard enough. Still, many people actually found peace in the church's explanations. In a world with no brain science, it felt better to think. Your suffering had some deeper meaning. It gave order to chaos, even if the treatments were a little chant-heavy. So, if you had mental struggles back then, your best hope wasn't compassion. It was a priest who was decent at listening and didn't shout demon too quickly. If you were really struggling, crying a lot, feeling lost, or staring at candles like they might answer you, your treatment got more serious. Maybe you started walking around barefoot, talking to yourself about angels, or arguing with farm animals about religion. At that point, the medieval solution wasn't therapy or a support group. It was a room, a very small, quiet room with one tiny window and no handle on your side. This was the monastic cell, what some historians call protective isolation. These tiny rooms were often tucked away inside monasteries or churches. They weren't meant to punish you, at least not in theory. They were supposed to protect both you and the outside world. You weren't chained up, hopefully, but you also weren't allowed to leave. Sometimes people stayed in these rooms for weeks, months, or even years. The space was simple, maybe a straw mat, stone walls, and if you were lucky, a small window through which someone might pass cold food twice a day. Contact with other people was rare. Monks believed madness might be catching spiritually, emotionally, or just through the air, so it was best to keep you isolated. But you weren't completely forgotten. Sometimes a monk would pray for your soul. Maybe one would bring herbs, or whisper scriptures outside your door. If you were lucky, he'd do it with kindness. If not, you were just another sad soul behind a wall. Not all these rooms were inside monasteries. Some were early versions of asylums. These weren't common, but a few existed, especially in medieval Islamic cities, and later in places like London and Paris. The purpose wasn't really to heal you. It was just to shelter you, keep you out of trouble and out of sight. Recovery wasn't really the goal. Still, medieval society wasn't always cruel. Some people believed those with mental struggles were actually closer to God, maybe touched by the divine, or halfway to sainthood. But practically, it was easier to lock someone away than to figure out how to help them. Many families begged monasteries to take in troubled relatives, often offering donations in return. It was better than having to explain to the neighbors why Uncle Thaddeus was reciting Latin to the sheep again. If you were a woman in this era and started feeling overwhelmed, angry, or tearful, maybe after having 11 children or dealing with a third husband who smelled like a plague, you were probably labeled as hysterical. That word didn't mean what it does now. Back then, it was a blanket excuse for any behavior from women that made men uncomfortable. Crying too much, hysteria, not crying at all, also suspicious. Sharing opinions, definitely a problem with your womb. The term hysteria actually comes from the Greek word for uterus, hystera, and yes, the theory was that a woman's womb could come loose and wander around her body, causing all kinds of chaos. It sounds wild, but many people truly believed it. According to them, a floating uterus could mess with your thoughts, cause fainting, nervousness, or even too much thinking, an actual diagnosis in some cases. Treatments for hysteria were strange. A priest might tell you to pray and fast. A physician might give you herbs. And in some awkward cases, Physical stimulation was prescribed to calm the uterus. That was done by midwives or lay. Early doctors who often had very little idea what they were doing. Marriage was also considered a cure. If a woman was single, she just needed a husband to settle her wound. If she was married already, the fix was pregnancy. Basically, the answer was always more chores and less rest. And if a woman kept behaving oddly, seeing visions, resisting chores, or reading too much, things could get worse. She might be accused of witchcraft. Back then, a woman with knowledge of herbs, strong opinions, or a pet cat could be labeled a witch. Still, it wasn't all bad. Some women found a kind of refuge in convents. Life there was quieter, and emotional pain was sometimes seen as a spiritual challenge. A few nuns even wrote about their sadness in surprisingly honest ways, minus the demon talk. But for most women, the best strategy was to stay quiet, keep their emotions brief, and definitely avoid talking to animals in public. Now, let's talk about the real MVPs of medieval mental health: herbalists. These were often older women who lived on the edge of town with gardens, cats, and an impressive knowledge of plants. They weren't licensed doctors, they were just wise and observant. People came to them when they felt low, anxious, or just off. These women listened, not to your humors or sins, but to your actual story. They'd ask when the sadness started, how you were sleeping, and whether your mother-in-law was driving you crazy again. Their prescriptions were simple: tea, tinctures, and talk. You might sit in a cottage full of drying herbs, sipping something made from lavender or valerian root while venting about your neighbor's goat. They treated sadness with calming tea, anxiety with chamomile, and serious distress with stronger plants like mugwort or stee tea, John's wort. In really bad cases, they gave poppy extract, which they called a sleep aid. You might call it time travel. These herbalists weren't trained in universities, but their knowledge came from generations of passed down wisdom, and most importantly, listening. And that made them suspicious. The church didn't like that these women operated outside of religious authority. They didn't use scripture, and they didn't blame everything on sin. So, some towns quietly valued them, others accused them of witchcraft, especially if they were too effective, too popular, or too confident. Still, for people struggling with what we'd now call depression, trauma, or burnout, these herbalists were often the only ones offering comfort. If you were lucky, your local wise woman would brew you a soothing tea, light a candle, and remind you that you weren't cursed, you were just tired and misunderstood. Were their treatments perfect? Not at all. Sometimes they had you rub onions on your feet, but compared to being locked in a stone room or screamed at by a monk with a goat skull, the herbalist's cottage felt like a luxury spa. Today, we understand depression as a mix of brain chemistry, life struggles, and sometimes just a really bad week. But in the Middle Ages, if you were feeling constantly low, tired, or like life was dragging you down in slow motion, people believed something very different. They thought you were guilty of a spiritual failure called acedia. This wasn't seen as a health issue. It was considered one of the early deadly sins until sloth eventually took its place and became the more famous version. Acedia was described as being sad or bored with everything good and divine. For monks and religious people, it was especially dangerous. They called it the noonday demon, that awful, restless feeling that hit in the middle of the day when they were supposed to be copying holy texts or praying. Imagine a monk staring at a wall, questioning the meaning of life. Today, we'd call that burnout. Back then, it was treated like a serious moral crisis. If someone admitted to feeling this way, they weren't comforted. They were told to pray harder, work more, and stop being selfish. Depression wasn't seen as something happening to you. It was your fault for not being holy enough, not repenting deeply, or not having enough faith. If you said out loud that you were deeply sad, it wasn't just bad, it was dangerous. People believed sorrow could spread, like mold on a wall, and monasteries didn't want that soaking into their sacred spaces. Everyday people weren't immune either. If you felt no joy in your work or couldn't smile at a festival, it wasn't seen as grief or exhaustion. It was a sign that you needed confession, and maybe a long list of chores to burn off the guilt. Strangely, some monks who wrote about acedia described feelings that sound very familiar today: numbness, fatigue, restlessness, even suicidal thoughts. But instead of therapy, they were told to fast and make mental lists of their sins in alphabetical order. You'd think laughter might help lift the gloom, especially when your life was full of fleas, mud, and regular plagues. But in medieval Europe, laughter wasn't always welcome. In fact, it could be a red flag. Sure, peasants laughed, jesters laughed, and maybe even monks chuckled if a goose did something especially ridiculous. But many serious people like church leaders thought laughter could be dangerous. It could lead to chaos, sin, or, worst of all, dancing. Some theologians said that too much laughter meant you were spiritually out of balance. One famous thinker, Thomas Aquinas, believed laughter should be controlled and used for higher purposes. Only laughing without a clear reason, that could mean the devil was getting into your thoughts. And if you were a woman who laughed freely, people assumed something suspicious, maybe even witchcraft. If you were quiet and serious, you were considered pious, or maybe just really thirsty. People who laughed at the wrong time, like during a funeral or while milking a goat, were seen as mentally disturbed, or even possessed. Random giggles could be a serious warning sign. Some religious communities even had strict rules for laughter. Novices, or young monks and nuns, were told not to laugh during meals, prayers, or basically any group activity. Joy was okay, but only if it stayed deep inside and never made your wine come out of your nose. Still, laughter didn't disappear. It survived in festivals, funny poems, and in that one village guy who made fart noises with his armpits. But it was always risky. Joy was allowed but never fully trusted. Today, talking to your cat might be cute. In the Middle Ages, it could get you in trouble or even accused of something serious. People back then had very specific ideas about who you could and could not talk to. People were fine, priests were better, but animals? Invisible angels? That was a problem. Cats, in particular, walked a fine line. On one hand, they kept rats away. On the other, they were quiet, mysterious, and never went to church. If you talked to your cat too much, people might say it was your familiare, magical helper sent by the devil to whisper secrets. If a bird gave you advice or you claimed a crow told your future, that wasn't poetic, it was dangerous, and maybe even illegal. Dogs were okay until they started showing up in your dreams, wearing robes and quoting Bible verses. And angels? People believed in them, of course. Religious texts said they were everywhere. But if you said angels were speaking to you all the time, you might be considered a prophet, or mad, or possessed. It depended on who you were and how much people liked you. Some people, especially mystics living in monasteries, claimed to see angels or hear voices. And because they were respected, educated, and didn't do it too loudly, they were often believed. But if you were just an average guy named Bertram, and you said you talked to squirrels about the nature of God, people were less accepting. You wouldn't be asked to write a fancy manuscript. You'd probably be asked to stop talking to squirrels or be locked up. In medieval times, mental illness lived on a thin edge. You were either seen as a strange curiosity or a shameful secret, and sometimes both, depending on whether it was market day. Some people with obvious mental struggles were not hidden away. They became part of daily village life. Maybe they muttered to themselves, walked in circles, or blessed random objects. These village madmen were often left alone, not because people understood mental health, but because they didn't know what else to do. They were treated like unpredictable weather, or that one goat who always escaped his pen. Annoying, but not evil. People gave them nicknames: Old Will the Wanderer, Ad Meg, or Tom Fool. These names sound silly now, but back then, they were almost affectionate. The madman became part of the town story. Children were told not to stare, which of course made them stare more. Sometimes a baker left out crusts, or a blacksmith fixed a broken walking stick. There was even a kind of respect for these people. If they said something strange while staring at the sky, villagers might wonder if it was a prophecy or just Wednesday, but this tolerance had limits. If someone became too loud, too violent, or too disruptive, patience ran out. Then came the priest, the isolation, or worse, you were tolerated, but only as long as you didn't make people uncomfortable. In private families, the picture was different. If someone was quietly suffering, feeling anxious, depressed, or withdrawn, the family usually kept it secret. Talking about it brought shame, and shame was dangerous. It could ruin your family's reputation, which mattered more than anything. Some families sent their relatives to monasteries or on religious journeys, hoping prayer and distance would help. Others simply hid them away. Support systems like therapy or mental health clinics didn't exist. The only option was to whisper prayers and pretend everything was okay. By the late 1400s, that began to change slowly. But in the medieval world, silence and secrecy were still the main ways people dealt with pain. By the end of the Middle Ages, something began to shift. Slowly and unevenly, people started rethinking how they saw mental illness. The changes didn't come quickly or kindly, but if you looked closely, there were signs that compassion was trying to break through. First, scholars started reading old books again. Thanks to Arabic scholars and translators in places like Spain and Sicily, Europe was reintroduced to the ancient Greek thinkers. These writers, while not modern scientists, had at least considered that mental problems might come from the body, not just sin or evil spirits. Some doctors even started writing about sadness, melancholy, and excitement mania in new ways. Their books included fewer Bible quotes and more observations about the body and mind. The treatments were still strange leeches and herbal stews, but at least the conversation was changing. At the same time, the idea of charity was evolving. In cities like Valencia and Cairo, early hospitals began separating patients with mental troubles from the general sick wards. Some of these places even had gardens, music, and surprise actual conversation. They weren't perfect, but they were a step up from being chained in a room and shouted at by monks. The printing press also helped. Suddenly, more people had access to books. New ideas about the mind spread faster. Sure, some of those ideas were completely wrong, but others started planting the seeds for what would eventually become modern psychology. Still, fear didn't go away. People were always suspicious of what they didn't understand. The line between being crazy and blessed was very thin. But now, for the first time, people with mental struggles were starting to be seen as just that, people, not just sinners or monsters. That shift, even if tiny, laid the foundation for future care. With shift focus to a different world now, nobility. From the outside, noble life looked like a dream. Fancy clothes, gold everywhere, servants, palaces. Whether in France's Versailles or Japan's imperial court, nobles seemed to live in a fantasy world. But behind the pearls and perfume, their lives were often emotionally painful and suffocating. Every move nobles made was controlled. In France, the king's morning routine was a public event. Nobles lined up just to watch him get out of bed. If you didn't show up for the right events, people talked. If people talked, your influence at court slipped. And if that happened, you were done. In Versailles, losing popularity could be more dangerous than losing your money. In Japan's ancient court in Kyoto, things weren't much different. Nobles there had to be experts in writing poems, playing instruments, calligraphy, and showing the right facial expressions. Every bow, every fan wave, even how long you held a gaze, it all had meaning. Social life wasn't fun, it was a constant performance. A walk through a garden could be a silent competition. A dance might decide your future. You weren't just living your life, you were starring in a play 24/7, with the entire court watching. The saddest part, nobles couldn't escape. Their status, which gave them so much power, also trapped them. Inheritance laws, arranged marriages, debt, and social pressure meant they rarely had control over their own futures. Behind closed doors, many noble men and women suffered emotionally. Some quietly broke down, some gave up, others simply went through life, playing a part they never chose. Nobles were supposed to be rich, but many of them were buried in debt. They wore expensive clothes, held lavish parties, and lived in grand houses, but often couldn't afford any of it. At Versailles, fashion was more important than owning land. A noble might spend a fortune on a new coat, just to stay in the social game. If you didn't dress the part, you disappeared. Nobles gambled on cards, horses, or land deals. Some mortgaged their estates just to afford one more season at court. King Louis XIV made this worse on purpose. He wanted nobles to spend big, so they'd stay loyal and dependent on him. A poor noble was easier to control. In England, things were similar. Nobles often lived in fancy London townhouses paid for entirely on credit. Tailors and wine cellars waited months, sometimes years, for payment. Families balanced on the edge of financial collapse, hoping a daughter married rich or a distant uncle died and left them money. In Russia, nobles owned large lands with serfs working them, yet many still didn't have cash. Their wealth was tied up in property. In cities like Moscow, they had to borrow constantly to keep up appearances. Pawnshops quietly accepted family jewels at night, hidden from the public eye. Japan's noble class had its own money problems. During peaceful times in the Tokugawa period, samurai shifted from warriors to paper pushers. Their government stipends shrank, but the cost of noble living didn't. Some secretly took side jobs teaching poetry or managing small estates to stay afloat. But admitting financial hardship was shameful, so the debts grew quietly. Being noble wasn't about having real money. It was about looking rich, and maintaining that illusion often came at a huge personal cost. Now, let's talk about scandal. If nobility had a second language, it was gossip. Behind the shiny surfaces of royal life were endless stories of affairs, secret children, betrayals. The more perfect someone looked on the outside, the messier their life probably was behind closed doors. In Versailles, people lived so close together that privacy didn't exist. But affairs were everywhere. Queen Marie Antoinette was constantly accused of romantic entanglements, sometimes true, often not. The reason the rumor stuck? Everyone knew someone who was guilty of exactly that. Scandal was the court's favorite currency. Being linked to the right affair could raise your status. Being caught in the wrong one could destroy your family's name. In England, things were just as wild. Lord Byron was rumored to have a child with his half-sister. It didn't stop him from being famous, but it made people whisper. Nobles were expected to have lovers, but only the right kind. Mistresses from the wrong background, like actresses or foreigners, were a major problem. They could lead to exile or even death. In Russia, Catherine the Great openly had lovers during her rule. She wasn't shy about it, and neither were her courtiers. Love and politics mixed freely, and affairs were used as tools for power, not just romance. Even in Japan, where court life was quiet and poetic, scandal slipped through. Secret love letters were exchanged. A haiku could hide the story of a midnight visit. People read between the lines literally. The most dangerous scandals, though, weren't about romance. They were about betrayal, treason, and hidden political moves. These stories weren't told out loud, they were whispered behind doors, written in code, and buried in archives. Noble life looked beautiful on the outside, but inside, it was often driven by fear, secrets, and the constant pressure to perform. Even though nobles had power, wealth, and beautiful homes, many of them carried a heavy emotional burden, spiritual fear. They had everything anyone could dream of, but many were deeply unsure about their souls, the afterlife, and whether they were living right in the eyes of God. In fact, their wealth sometimes made this fear worse. In Catholic France, guilt was everywhere. Nobles went to church, attended mass, and donated to monasteries. But at night, some were haunted by their sins. They partied, lied, betrayed, and even killed in the name of power, and then tried to pray it all away. Some, like King Louis XIV, grew more religious as they got older. He built churches and confessed more often, clearly worried about how God might judge him for the wars and excesses of his reign. Donating to the church wasn't just a kind act. Many nobles saw it as a form of spiritual insurance. If they gave money or built chapels, maybe God would forgive them more easily. Lighting 1,000 candles, sponsoring a monastery, it all helped them sleep at night. Some even gave up their royal lifestyle completely in their old age, choosing to live in monasteries and wear simple clothes. It wasn't always about peace, it was often about fear. In Orthodox Russia, things were more intense. Nobles weren't just expected to help run the country, they were supposed to uphold religious values too. But many of them doubted. The czars called themselves chosen by God, even while doing terrible things like purging entire families. Some nobles secretly joined prayer groups or sought advice from strange holy men called fools for Christ, wanderers who dressed poorly and spoke uncomfortable truths. In Japan, nobles faced their own spiritual struggles. They were caught between several belief systems: Confucian ethics, Shinto traditions, and Buddhist teachings. Some took up Zen meditation to quiet their thoughts. Others poured their feelings into poetry as a way to deal with their inner pain. And when a noble committed seppuku ritual suicide, it wasn't always about shame. Sometimes it was a desperate search for peace. Despite all the luxury around them, nobles were often lost. They wore fine clothes, sat in decorated halls, and attended fancy rituals. But deep down, many were still searching for meaning. Their souls were whispering, sometimes screaming for something real. Now, imagine a time before phones, emails, or even telegraphs. Back then, the most dangerous thing a noble could send wasn't a sword, it was a letter. Words written in ink could ruin lives. One badly written line could start a war, destroy a marriage, or expose a secret. Nobles wrote constantly. Letters weren't just for casual chat. They were tools of power. People sent love notes, pleas for money, flattery, and secret plans all by hand. At Versailles, every noble had a collection of letters, to mistresses, to enemies, to the king. Some even used secret codes or invisible ink. In one case, a noble wrote coded letters to rebels before the French Revolution. After his death, someone cracked the code and found out he had been involved in treason the whole time. In other cases, people pretended to write about weather or poetry, but hid deeper messages between the lines. A letter that seemed like it was about birds could actually be about a secret marriage proposal. In Japan, letters were often written in the form of short poems. A single verse could express forbidden love or a secret meeting. Noble women were especially good at writing these double-meaning messages. Sometimes they'd receive a poem at night and write a reply by morning. The messenger might be a child or servant sworn to secrecy. In Russia, some noblewomen ran underground networks. Using letters, they'd write to allies in far-off courts and pass messages hidden in gifts or books. Some letters were burned before they could be read. Others were lost for centuries in walls or drawers. But the ones that survived still tell stories of rebellion, love, and fear. For nobles, writing was everything. It was a weapon, a shield, and sometimes a confession. The riskiest letters were the ones that never made it intercepted, burned, or buried with their sender. Even emotions were dangerous for nobles. They had to hide their true feelings at all costs. Joy, sadness, anger, they were all considered risky. At court, every feeling had to be carefully controlled. In France, nobles lived like actors in a constant play. Their smiles, bows, and even their silences were rehearsed. Raising your eyebrow the wrong way could start a political war. Crying in public, even at a funeral, could ruin your image. People who showed too much emotion were called unstable or weak. Noble children were trained from a young age to hide what they felt. Pride had to be quiet. Grief had to be invisible. If you had a breakdown at a ball, it could be remembered for years and used against you in the future. In Japan's court, emotions were even more controlled. Nobles were expected to speak in poetry and metaphors, not from the heart. A half-open fan or a picked flower could say more than words. A woman's sleeve might reveal heartbreak. A single cherry blossom could mean despair. In England, nobles were expected to keep a stiff upper lip. That meant never showing emotion in public. Instead, they poured their sadness into private journals, leather-bound books filled with rage, sorrow, and confusion. Some nobles cracked under the pressure. There are records of nobles collapsing during events or being quietly sent away for rest. These were called private tragedies. No one talked about them. The show had to go on. In noble life, emotion was a weakness. People wore masks every day, not just at parties. Behind every bow, every compliment, every laugh, there was often a storm hidden perfectly behind silk and manners.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to share an incredible true story that will absolutely restore your faith in humanity. It's about Robert Downey Jr., the man we all know and love as Iron Man, and a moment that shows us what real kindness looks like. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button if you enjoy these inspiring stories, and don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. Trust me, this story is going to touch your heart. So picture this. Robert Downey Jr., one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood, worth millions of dollars, could literally be doing anything he wants on any given day. He could be relaxing in his massive Malibu mansion, driving one of his expensive cars, or hanging out with other celebrities. But instead, he made a choice that most people would never expect. He decided to put on his most casual, ordinary clothes and visit a local homeless shelter. Now, this wasn't some big publicity stunt with cameras following him around. There were no reporters, no social media posts planned, and no movie promotion involved. Robert genuinely wanted to spend time with people who were going through tough times. He wanted to sit down, have real conversations, and maybe offer some hope to people who society often overlooks or ignores. When Robert arrived at the shelter, he didn't announce who he was. He didn't want special treatment or for people to act differently around him. He simply found a quiet spot and started talking to the residents there. He listened to their stories, shared some laughs, and just tried to be a regular person connecting with other regular people. For those moments, he wasn't Tony Stark or a movie star. He was just Robert, a guy who cared enough to show up. While Robert was sitting there having these meaningful conversations, a young girl was also at the shelter. She was probably a volunteer, someone who regularly came by to help serve food and spend time with the residents. This girl had a heart full of compassion and was the kind of person who saw someone in need and immediately wanted to help. As she was walking around with plates of food, making sure everyone was fed, she spotted Robert sitting by himself. Her eyes, he looked like just another person who might be hungry. His clothes were simple, nothing fancy or expensive looking. He blended in perfectly with everyone else there. She didn't see a celebrity or a millionaire. She just saw another human being who might need some kindness. Without hesitation, this girl walked straight up to Robert with a warm smile and a plate of food. She looked at him with genuine care in her eyes and said, "Hey, homeless man, take this food." There was no judgment in her voice, no pity, just pure human kindness. She wanted to make sure he had something to eat, just like she was doing for everyone else there. Now, Robert could have reacted in so many different ways. He could have been offended, or quickly corrected her, or even laughed about the misunderstanding. But he didn't do any of those things. Instead, he just smiled. A genuine, warm smile that showed he understood exactly what was happening, and he was touched by it. Robert accepted the food graciously and thanked her. He didn't immediately reveal who he was because he recognized something beautiful in that moment. This girl wasn't being kind because she wanted something in return, or because she recognized him, or because cameras were rolling. She was being kind simply because that's who she is. She saw someone she thought needed help, and her immediate instinct was to provide that help. This is exactly what Robert was hoping to experience during his visit. He wanted to witness genuine human compassion, the kind that exists when nobody is watching, when there's nothing to gain, when it's just one person caring for another person. But then, as these things sometimes happen, the girl took a closer look at Robert. Maybe it was his voice when he thanked her, or maybe something about his face seemed familiar. Suddenly, Her eyes went wide with recognition. You can imagine the thoughts racing through her mind. Wait a minute. Is that... No, it can't be. Oh my goodness, that's Robert Downey Jr. The realization hit her like a lightning bolt. Here she was, standing in front of Iron Man himself, having just offered him food, thinking he was homeless. The shock on her face must have been priceless. She probably felt like she was in some kind of dream or movie scene herself. Immediately, the girl started apologizing profusely. She was probably embarrassed, maybe even mortified about the whole situation. She might have been thinking she had somehow disrespected this famous actor or made a terrible mistake. You could see the panic in her eyes as she tried to figure out what to say or do next. But Robert stopped her right there. He gently told her that she had absolutely nothing to apologize for. In fact, he explained that what she had just done was one of the most beautiful things he had witnessed in a long time. He told her that her act of kindness, her immediate instinct to help someone she thought was in need, was exactly what the world needs more of. Robert explained to her that she had seen him as just another person who might be hungry, and without any hesitation, she offered help. She didn't do it for recognition, for social media likes, or because she knew who he was. She did it because she has a good heart and genuinely cares about people. That kind of authentic compassion is rare and precious. He told her that in a world where people often walk past those in need, where homelessness is sometimes ignored or stigmatized, her immediate response to offer food and kindness was inspiring. She treated him with dignity and respect, the same way every person deserves to be treated regardless of their circumstances. This entire encounter reveals something profound about human nature and society. The girl's reaction shows us what pure, unfiltered kindness looks like. She didn't help Robert because he was famous or wealthy. She helped him because she thought he was a person in need, and that was enough. That's the kind of compassion that changes the world, one person at a time. On the flip side, Robert's presence at the shelter and his reaction to the girl's kindness shows us that fame and fortune don't have to change who you are at your core. Despite having everything money can buy, he chose to spend his time with people who have very little. He recognized the value in connecting with others and using his privilege to bring attention to important issues, even if quietly. The story also highlights how our assumptions about people can be completely wrong. The girl assumed Robert was homeless based on his appearance and location, but assumptions work both ways. Many people assume that celebrities don't care about regular folks or social issues. Robert proved that assumption wrong too. In our current world, where social media often showcases the worst in humanity, where people seem more divided than ever, and where acts of kindness sometimes feel rare, this story gives us hope. It reminds us that there are still people out there with hearts full of compassion, ready to help without expecting anything in return. It also shows us that we never really know who we're interacting with on any given day. The person sitting next to you on the bus, the individual asking for help on the street corner, or even the celebrity visiting a homeless shelter. Everyone has a story, everyone deserves respect, and everyone has the capacity for both giving and receiving kindness. This story encourages us to be more like that girl. When we see someone who might need help, our first instinct should be to offer assistance, not to judge or make assumptions. And when we have the opportunity to help others, we should do it quietly and genuinely, without needing recognition or praise. The beautiful thing about this story is that both Robert and the girl walked away changed by the experience. The girl learned that kindness is never wasted, even when offered to someone who might not need it in the way you expected. Robert was reminded of the pure goodness that exists in people, and probably left that shelter feeling more grateful than when he arrived. This encounter lasted probably just a few minutes, but its impact will likely last a lifetime for both of them. It's a perfect example of how small acts of kindness can create ripple effects that we may never fully understand. So I want to challenge you. The next time you see someone who might need help, don't hesitate. Offer assistance, share a kind word, or simply acknowledge their humanity. You never know who you might be helping, and more importantly, you never know how much that small act of kindness might mean to them. What do you think about this incredible story? Have you ever experienced or witnessed something similar? Have you ever helped someone without knowing who they were, or maybe been surprised by someone's kindness when you least expected it? Share your stories in the comments below. I love reading about real-life moments of human connection and compassion. If this story inspired you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends and family. Sometimes we all need reminders that there's still good in the world. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
By now, you've seen that medieval and noble life, though covered in gold and tradition, was full of silent suffering. There were no therapists, no mental health breaks, and very little understanding of emotional struggles. People in power were expected to be perfect. Everyone else was expected to survive. But there's still one more thing to talk about: how these societies coped with all that emotional pain. Let's start with rituals. Whether it was religion or royal ceremony, rituals gave people structure. These were scheduled, repeated, and predictable moments that made life feel a little more stable. In a world full of uncertainty, plagues, wars, bad crops, knowing that Mass was every Sunday, that prayers were at certain hours, or that the king would walk the same path every morning helped people stay grounded. Rituals also gave people something else: permission to feel. During funerals, people were allowed to cry. At festivals, they could laugh and dance. During religious holidays, they could reflect and mourn. Even the most controlled societies allowed emotions at specific times. These moments helped people release their feelings just in controlled bursts. It wasn't much, but it was something. Another way people coped was through art. Art was everywhere. Nobles commissioned paintings, sculptures, and music not just to show off, but to express emotions they couldn't say out loud. A painting of a weeping saint might reflect their own sorrow. A poem written in secret might be the only place they could admit fear or desire. In Japan, poetry was a daily tool for emotional survival. A noblewoman might write dozens of short poems each week, not just for romance, but to deal with grief, boredom, or frustration. These poems were shared like private letters, wrapped in layers of meaning. A cherry blossom falling in a poem wasn't just a flower, it was a symbol of loss, longing, or letting go. Even in harsh places like prisons or locked rooms, people found ways to cope. They carved names into walls. They whispered prayers. They sang lullabies. Sometimes they just watched the sky and tried to remember that the world was still moving. And of course, people coped through storytelling. Families passed down tales of heroes, saints, and spirits. These stories were more than entertainment. They were lessons, comforts, and warnings. If you were suffering, maybe you were like the hero in the story. If you felt unseen, maybe an angel was watching. If you were lost, maybe there was still a path forward. Storytelling was especially powerful for those who had no voice in society: women, the poor, and the mentally ill. Through stories, they found meaning in their struggles. Even madness could be seen as a sign of divine vision in the right tale. And those stories told by firelight, passed down in whispers, kept people going. Now, it's talk about modern lessons. We live in a very different time, but some of the emotional struggles haven't changed. People still feel pressure to succeed, to smile when they're hurting, to perform instead of heal. Social media can feel like a royal court. Family expectations still weigh heavy. Some people are still expected to carry entire legacies while pretending it doesn't hurt. But we also have something many people in the past didn't: choices. We can talk about our feelings without being punished usually. We can go to therapy, take medicine, rest. We can say, "not okay," and not be seen as weak. We have words like anxiety, depression, and trauma, terms that help explain what once was only called madness or sin. History reminds us how far we've come, but also how much farther we can go. We don't chain people up for being different anymore, but we still sometimes judge those who don't fit in. We don't call sadness a sin, but we still rush people to get over it. We say, self-care, but sometimes we mean, hurry up and be productive again. So what can we learn from the past? Maybe this, that emotions are not failures. That being tired or sad or angry doesn't mean you're broken. That people in gold robes and silk slippers suffered just like anyone else and often had fewer tools to deal with it. We can also learn that sometimes rebellion looks small. It's writing a journal, turning off your phone, crying when you need to, saying no to something that hurts you. These acts may seem simple, but in a world that pushes perfection, they're powerful. Most importantly, we can remember that people have always searched for comfort, meaning, and peace. Whether in monasteries, palaces, or quiet cottages, they've always wanted to feel better, and even if their methods were flawed, the desire to heal was human and noble. So next time you're struggling, remember this: you're not alone. You never were. Someone 500 years ago probably sat by candlelight feeling just like you. They didn't have words for it, but they felt it just the same. And maybe, somewhere in a forgotten corner of a ruined castle or a dusty library, their story still echoes, waiting to remind you that your pain is real, your feelings matter, and you're part of a much bigger, older human story.